The medieval castles were built to house kings, knights, lords, ladies, their hundreds of servants, and, let's be honest, an overwhelming number of rats. Despite all the grand feasts and festivals we see in Hollywood movies, life inside a castle was more ew than ah. Think drafty rooms, no plumbing, and questionable smells around every corner. So, grab your nose plugs as we dive into the less than glamorous reality of living in a medieval castle. Number 1. Living arrangements. Castles back in the medieval times weren't cozy homes for the nobles, but they were full of people. You can imagine them like crowded little towns stuffed into a giant stone box. At the top of the order, you've got the lord and lady lounging in their private chambers. These rooms had the luxury of a bit of space, sometimes a fireplace, windows for light, and maybe even a 4-poster bed. Now, don't be jealous as they were still drafty and cold. The rest of the house was a totally different story. Servants often crashed on the floors of the Great Hall or in tiny, cramped rooms without any proper ventilation. Soldiers and guards bunked near strategic points like towers or gates, always ready for action. The cooks sometimes napped right there among the pots, just because they were so busy with the endless cooking. Plus, there wasn't much privacy. Your status dictated your comfort, and if you were low on the ladder, you better get used to snoring roommates and sharing straw mattresses. Number 2. Toilets and waste disposal. Now, where would a medieval lord or lady go when nature calls? Well, there weren't any plumbing systems and running water, so castles had these things called garderobes, which were basically stone closets with a hole that dropped your business straight into the moat or a cesspit at the very bottom. Imagine the smell wafting up through the hole while you're trying to concentrate. They sometimes stuffed herbs in there to mask the stench, but it wasn't enough. The smell and rot would peak during hot summer months and cause illnesses because they didn't exactly know about germs back then. There were some unfortunate servants called gong farmers who had the job of shoveling out the waste into baskets and wheelbarrows and taking it off to bury or spread on fields as fertilizer. It wasn't a very fancy job, so they were quite well paid because not many people wanted the job. One gong farmer in 1325 even fell into a cesspit and drowned. So you can imagine. The moats that we see around castles weren't built for looks or defense. They were basically open sewers, and all the castle's waste would dump straight into them. Number 3. Healing the sick with primitive methods. It was a time with no medical science or medicine, so when somebody fell ill, which was very frequent, the medicine would be a mix of herbs and prayers. The lady of the castle often played nurse, whipping up potions from the herb garden. Got a fever? Here, chew on some willow bark. Wounds? Slap on a honey dressing and hope for the best. Castles had no hospitals, but they had basic sick rooms where the injured or diseased were quarantined, if they were lucky. There was no anesthesia, no sterilization, so surgeries were painful and dangerous. So overall, it was a pretty bad thing to fall ill. Number 4. Infestations of unwanted pests in the castle. Despite their grandeur, castles were plagued with infestations of rats, mice, fleas, and lice. Grain storage areas attracted rodents, while the straw-filled mattresses and rust-covered floors became breeding grounds for lice and fleas. These pests were not just an annoyance, but spread diseases like the Black Death. The contained food supplies further jeopardized the health of the residents. Efforts to manage infestations were minimal and mostly ineffective. Cats and traps were commonly used, and aromatic herbs like mint or wormwood were scattered in living areas to repel pests. However, these measures barely scratched the surface of the problem. The combination of poor sanitation, waste accumulation, and cramped living conditions made castles ideal environments for pests to thrive. So you can say that rats and other pests were a common sight in the castles. Number 5. The castle kitchens. The castle kitchen was the heart of daily activity, a bustling, smoky, and chaotic place where meals for hundreds were prepared. Servants worked tirelessly, often in shifts, as feeding an entire castle was a never-ending task. These kitchens were massive, designed to handle large-scale cooking with open hearths, ovens, and boiling cauldrons. These kitchens were designed for efficiency, often located near storerooms and pantries to reduce the labor of transporting heavy supplies. The meat was often roasted on spits over open flames, turned by kitchen boys who had to endure hours of intense heat. The cooks used seasonal ingredients, fresh vegetables, fruits, and herbs from the gardens in summer, and preserved foods like salted meats and pickled vegetables during winter. The bread was a staple, baked in huge quantities in wood-fire ovens. Kitchens were smoky and hot, with little ventilation, and sanitation was minimal, contributing to occasional outbreaks of foodborne illnesses. I'll tell you more about the water supply and daily entertainment options in medieval castles in just a moment. But first, hit the like button and subscribe. It's way easier than hauling buckets of water up a castle tower, I promise. Thanks a ton. Now let's get back to the medieval madness. Number 6. Food storage and preservation. Food preservation was vital for survival in medieval castles, especially during harsh winters or prolonged sieges. Castles had extensive storage facilities, including granaries, cellars, and pantries, designed to keep food edible for months. The meat was preserved through salting, drying, or smoking, with barrels of salted beef, pork, and fish stored in cool, damp cellars to prevent spoilage. Vegetables like cabbage or carrots were pickled in vinegar or brine, while fruits were dried or made into preserves. For bread supply, grains were stored in bulk but required constant vigilance to prevent infestations of rats, mice, or insects. The cheese was aged to improve its shelf life, and butter was stored in cool areas to avoid spoiling. Ale was brewed on site and wasn't only a popular beverage, but also a method of preserving barley and providing a safer alternative to contaminated water. During feasts and banquets, which were held for special occasions, enormous quantities of food were consumed. Nobles dined on roast meats like venison, swan, or boar, served alongside spiced stews, fresh bread, and imported delicacies like figs and almonds, while the servants ate much simpler meals like coarse bread, pottage, which is a vegetable stew, and salted fish. Number 7. Keeping warm in the winter. Medieval castles were famously cold, and their thick stone walls acted more as insulation against outside attacks than the winter chill. To combat the cold, large open fireplaces were the primary source of heat and were strategically placed in main halls and chambers. However, much of the heat escaped up the chimney, so warmth was often limited to the area immediately around the fire. The tapestries weren't just for the look. They served as insulation, blocking drafts from stone walls and windows. The rooms were warmed with thick curtains and carpets, and personal spaces relied on furs, layered wool clothing, and even heated stones or bricks placed in bedding to keep the person warm during the night. Number 8. Water supply. Water in medieval castles came from a variety of sources, depending on the castle's location. Many had wells dug deep into the ground, often inside the keep. These wells sometimes reached depths of over 100 feet, and the water was drawn manually using buckets. Castles near rivers or springs utilized structures called aqueducts, or pipes made of clay and lead to channel water to cisterns or storage tanks. Rainwater collection was another common method, using gutters and large stone basins to store it for daily use. But maintaining clean water was challenging. Wells could become contaminated by nearby waste, and cistern water often becomes stagnant. It was a daily task to carry the heavy burden of fetching and distributing water, especially for bathing or kitchen use. Number 9. Lighting up the night. The medieval castles were notoriously dark after sundown, with lighting coming from candles, oil lamps, and torches. Candles were primarily made of animal fat called tallow, which smelled unpleasant and filled the place with smoke. Beeswax candles were a luxurious alternative reserved for nobles or religious ceremonies, thanks to their clean burn and sweet scent. The torches were made by wrapping cloth around sticks and soaking them in pitch or animal fat, which provided brighter light but were messy and dangerous indoors. Lighting was minimum because producing it was expensive and took too much work. Servants were tasked with lighting fires and replacing candles or torches, but these lights did very little to scatter the deep shadows of a castle. People woke up with the sun every day to utilize all the daylight and went to bed early to save resources or simply learn to live with the gloom. Number 10. Everyday entertainment. Life in a medieval castle wasn't all hard work in keeping the place warm. People knew how to keep themselves entertained, and they got pretty creative about it. For the nobles, evenings in the Great Hall were the highlight. Musicians and poets brought music to life with flutes, harps, and even early bagpipes. They'd sing ballads about heroes and romance, or even poke fun at current events. There was lots of storytelling with legends of knights and mythical creatures. They also played board games like chess and backgammon. The servants had their own kind of fun. Dice games were super popular. Singing and dancing weren't just for special occasions. A fiddle or drum would get everyone moving after a long day. Big events like harvest festivals or tournaments brought everyone together. There'd be lance fights on horses called jousting, feasts, and even plays performed by traveling troops. So did you find medieval castle life interesting, or was it too much for your liking? Tell us down in the comments. Now check out this video on the screen, and I'll see you there.